Oh, my sweet summer child, George Russell. Actually, I wouldn't even say he is a summer child since my boy is probably super traumatized by now. So, if you have been paying attention this season, and hey, even if you weren't, just looking at the championship standing should fill you up with confusion and sadness. Heading into this season, George Russell was blabbering on about how he could win the title with this sick new Mercedes car that'll be the fastest on the grid and uncontested. And we got to give him credit where it's due. The Mercedes car is the fastest one. It is very uncontested at times. However, it's Kimi Antonelli on top with George not even close to him. It is obviously very sad for George since he had high expectations for himself, but he has actually hit them. Let's not joke around. George hasn't just forgotten how to drive. He is driving well and showing great pace in the car. It's just not Kimi's pace. In the early bit of the season, the two drivers were very close, but after Canada, George has seen a sharp downturn in his pace to Kimi, and looking within, it is easy to understand why. At Canada, George suffered an engine DNF, which saw Kimi win and take a huge advantage out in front for the championship. This, of course, doesn't help his confidence in himself, which was already compromised thanks to Miami featuring deployment issues and Japan featuring the same exact thing. And what doesn't help this is how in Monaco, it's more of the same for George. Then Barcelona qualifying, it happens again. Austria thankfully didn't feature any issues for once, which saw George win. Silverstone largely didn't feature issues apart from Ferrari inserting their asses in between George and qualifying. However, in the race made up the places, only for a slow puncture to occur in a similar vein to secure 2020, but was still able to get beat to by the end of it, courtesy of Kimi's car killing itself, of course. So as we head into Spa, it does seem George is back in business after some low confidence and a self-destructing car started to remove themselves. But it was only temporary since George's car on lap 1 suffered some more deployment issues, and to top it all off, got punted off the road by Sir Lewis and out of the race on lap 1. Right when it looked like things were on the up for George, reality set in once more and removed any and all hope he had of digging into Kimi's lead. Now, to be fair though, Lando was in a similar position last year, but he was never some 50 points behind Kimi. George is in such a worse predicament, and when he is facing issue after issue in his car, while Kimi isn't at the same frequency, George is left with the paramount decision. After this season, will he reconsider his place at the team? Well, stay tuned to find out. Subscribe if you have also been cheated on, and make sure to check out the Crash Happy podcast for upcoming summer slop. So with that said, let's get to quacking now.
A good weather for a race, but especially for a talk.
Let's talk about option number 1, the most basic one, stick with Mercedes. And I say it's basic, but we shouldn't criticize George if he sticks with this one. Let us remember that he is a Mercedes Junior, their first successful one at that, since Lauren knows Ocon hasn't lived to his potential and Pascal Wehrlein got relegated to FE. George has been with Merc since day one, and a lot of his junior success is thanks to Toto's aid. Plus, he has fully integrated himself into the Mercedes work team, of course, and has plenty of notable results with them. It's only natural that Georgia wants to stick with Mercedes and hope for better days instead of taking a risk and potentially derailing your career. So what would this reality look like? Well, I'm going to be super optimistic here and say Georgia's second half of the season will be much better than his first half. I think the title is a foregone conclusion at this point, but that don't mean George can't redeem himself in the eyes of many, since while many do acknowledge that George is suffering car problem after car problem, many still look at George as this crash-happy driver who is carried by machinery instead of being genuinely good. So when they saw his big game heading into this year and now look at his results, they don't think twice. They say George is proving that he's always been terrible and a dickhead. And unfortunately, many people believe them since, well, to be fair, George is a bit of a dickhead, so it is easy to hate on him. But that don't mean his driving is bad. I think post-summer break, we will see George way more on the podium and on the top step of it, and maybe even get more wins than Kimi. However, Kimi would have done enough in the first half and still comfortably wins the title in a pretty Rosberg-esque manner. Of course, he won't retire though, so for 2027 and beyond, how will these years look? Well, obviously, no matter what George does, he will always be hated on, since I doubt George will try and change his behavior to become favorable to some random dude in their basement. This is whatever for George. I'm sure he's used to the criticism by now, but how will Merc take to this? Because the hatred for George only really started building in 2022. However, it didn't really explode until the end of 2024 with George's lashing out of anger and borderline violent speech about Max. Since then, George has been criticized nearly every day, and again, George is used to this. How about Mercedes? Because even if the criticism is mostly stupid shit, it's still very bad publicity for the team. And this was fine when Lewis was in the other car, since being a contender for the greatest of all time will give you a lot of fans, but an equal amount of haters. However, now Kimi is in the car, and Kimi is just a baby. Sure, maybe to some his driving standards may be bad, but most don't care because he isn't bending the car or forcing others out of the race, unlike a certain somebody with a track record spanning multiple years. Kimi is widely beloved by the community, while George is widely hated by the community. Now, this is pure bad publicity for Merc, since George is weighing down the team's reputation, especially since now he's the solely hated on driver at the team. And if you think that Merc probably don't care about this, trust me, they do. When you think of McLaren, do you think of warmly Oscar and his cozy personality, or do you think of loud and annoying Lando Norris? Most of you would probably think of Lando, since he has been with the team longer and is of course now champion. But since Lando is pretty unlikable, it leads to most having an unfavorable view on McLaren, despite lovely Oscar being right there. And when most people think of Mercedes, they would think of George, since he has been there for a while now and has become the face of it since Lewis's departure. If George were to become champion, even more people would think of George more, and because he is unlikable, they would think of Mercedes in a less than ideal fashion. Some could argue Toto has already taken measures to prevent this season by saying Kimi is purposely giving better cars, engines, and personnel so he could win over George and make Mercedes more favorable in the eyes of many. I think that is a little exaggeratory. However, I wouldn't put it past Toto to do something like that. So to bring it back around, if George is going to stick with Merc for 2027 and beyond, he needs to get comfortable with the idea that he will not be number one, and if he attempts to be so, all it will do is drag down Mercedes' name. He can win races here and there and build a legacy, but do not go near the title, and if he does, he shouldn't expect preferential treatment unless Kimi is fully out of the equation for it. It is a bleak reality, but think of it this way: George is guaranteed to still have a place at the team and have great opportunities to accumulate wins and whatnot. He could try to fight for the title, but he would have to dig really deep for it. But hey, at least wins can be guaranteed. Plus, of course, George has the security of being contracted with the team for a long time, since he is great, of course, and Toto would be an idiot to just drop him outright based on personality. It would bring George stability in his career. However, of course, with the drawback of never really owning or commanding the team as its sole number one, and that is thanks to his controversial personality he has established for himself throughout the years, and of course an Italian teenager who is more likable and just as, if not better than George. However, what if George hates this idea? What if he sees it as a purgatory and would rather take a risk and transfer to a team willing to put up with him, all for the chance to win the title? Well, let's quickly eliminate the teams that George wouldn't move to, which of course are basically all the midfield teams. Now, there is a chance that a team like Audi, Alpine, or even Aston could become front runners soon and start to contest for big things. If that happens, then shit, why not? Especially for a team like Audi, who I could genuinely see climbing up the grid. But for the purposes of this video, let's just look at each of the front running teams, which leaves Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren to talk about, of course. Let's speak about the least likely option first. Ferrari. Ferrari are very conservative when it comes to the drivers they choose. They only like two types of drivers to drive for them: white people and Christians. I mean, their own talent they develop, or established world champions. Prime example is their current lineup: Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's golden boy, and Lewis Hamilton, who needs no introduction. George is neither a Ferrari Academy driver nor a world champion, so Ferrari would be very reluctant to hire him, especially adding on the fact that Ollie Behrman is surely guaranteed to move to the team next, and even if he is poached, good thing Rafael Camara is developing well and fast. Okay, so how about McLaren? Well, McLaren would be a good option since they are a team that, while they have a struggle here and there, have at least proven they could build title winning cars. And even if they fail like this year, they still build fast enough cars to satisfy any driver with ambition. Of course, McLaren this year are suffering from astoundingly terrible reliability, but I doubt this issue will persist in 2027 and definitely by 2028. So McLaren seems like a good option then? Maybe. I won't say no, just maybe. I say this because the issue at McLaren are their drivers. Oscar Piastri will likely be the one getting the boot if another driver were to join, and imagine this real quick. Lando Norris, who's a champion, would like more, paired up with George Russell, who wants a title just like Oscar, but is also a dick now. If McLaren wanted to ruin the team they have built and make it into a super toxic environment, then hey, go right ahead. At least it will be slightly better than Lando and Max, but that don't mean George and Lando are a good pairing. Some may point out and say, oh, but Lando and George are friends and they like to hang out. Bro, is this 2020? I don't know if you have noticed, but I certainly have. Lando and George have grown quite distant since the two of them have been able to fight for podiums on track. They are rivals now. They don't hate each other, and maybe they do still like each other, but not enough anymore where they could just be buddy-buddy off track and pretend nothing has ever happened. And even if they are, they certainly won't be if they get paired at McLaren. It would be Mercedes all over again, and unless McLaren want to destroy everything they have been working towards, then they would just never do this. However, if Lando were for some reason to leave the team, then I actually think a George and Oscar pairing would do quite well, and at the very least, just be a dynamic similar to what they already have. Which, saying it out loud, I don't know if that's a good thing. So all that's left is Red Bull. No way in hell a Max and George pairing would ever happen, so it would be George and Isak, or Liam, or Lindblad, or Solov, maybe all four at some point. Regardless, I think George will be able to stand toe-to-toe with some should they reach their potential, if not outright be better than all of them. A lot of people forget that George is a good-ass driver. He's by far the best out of the 2019 bunch, and hell, y'all have said it. Remember how everyone said Max and George were the best drivers last year, and they would deliver us a generational title fight? Don't go backtracking now. So George at Red Bull's the best option then? Well, yeah, kinda, and it's the only good option for him. If you saw my Oscar vid about a week ago, you would know that I said while Oscar to Red Bull is a good move, it wouldn't be reliable since once their talent fully develops, Oscar would be pushed aside potentially. Good thing that George is better than Oscar though, and again, good enough to at least stand toe-to-toe with a Lindblad, Hadjar, or Solov, and will have to take a much better Red Bull talent to fully dominate over Russell. So let's summarize. George's best options outside of Mercedes isn't Ferrari since he doesn't have their ideal resume, isn't McLaren since a Lando George pairing will be more toxic than some poison type Pokemon. However, if the pairing is George and Oscar, then it will be more favorable. But the safest and best move for George is going to be Red Bull, since with Max on the out soon, George could easily fit right in and deliver similar enough results to Max. Not fully replicate them, of course. So let's finally answer the question from the beginning. Should George up and leave Mercedes after this year? And when I say this, I don't mean literally after 2026, I just mean sometime after 2026. So either is he staying with Merc for years to come, or is leaving give or take 1 to 3 years? Well, in my opinion, I think George, despite all the failures and anger this year, will stick with Mercedes. However, maybe not because he wants to. Think of this from Toto's perspective. Toto, in the end, still loves George, I think. I mean, he was his first successful talent brought into the team, and George is not doing anything to warrant Toto to be like, oh, your ass, don't let the door hit you on the way out. No, George is performing very good for Toto standards, and ideally, he wants George to stay. He don't want him hogging up all the spotlight with his shitty personality, making everyone else look bad, but he don't want him gone since replacing a driver of his caliber is gonna be tough. So what Toto will do, I think, is give George as much of a blank check as possible to ensure his signature for years to come, and of course give him opportunities to win a race here and there. He's essentially gonna mold George into a better Bottas, allowed to be very good here and there, but ultimately not allowed to truly contest for the title. Of course there is some nuance there, but who cares? You get the idea. I think by doing all of that, Toto also avoids the issue of this partnership turning into Mercedes, since Kimi can go out and win big things while George will be forced to play into a very minor number 2 role basically. Now this is just what I think. I can also see George hating this and hating it enough that despite Toto's pleas and desperate contracts, could still up and leave. And if that does happen, then again, Red Bull is the only option for George where it may not go that bad for him. Of course, that is if Red Bull can actually exceed or be on par to Mercedes, of course. Either way, big decisions will soon have to be made by George Russell. And one thing is for sure, depending on how the rest of the season will go, will decide George Russell's fate for years to come, if not the rest of his career. So those were my thoughts on George and Mercedes. George has been hurt real bad by Merc this year, so even if he does up and leave, I would not blame him in the slightest. And it's tough too, since George is of course no number 2 driver. He is very good, but it is such a shame that Kimi Antonelli truly is a generational talent. No matter what George chooses to do, all I'm saying is I don't blame him for whatever he does next. Anyways, I'm going to give a quick shout out to Amarillo Flock for the continued support, and make sure to join out for all cool benefits as well as just helping me out. Anyways, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you have a like and subscribe since it really helps me out. Make sure to let me know in the comments what you think of this, and as always, have an amazing day.
Good weather for the duck.